Hey everyone, my name is Chris A, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different from what I normally do. Today's video is going to be more of a podcast format, unscripted, long form, and I have a guest with me. I've split this into two different parts. This is part one of two. Let me know if you like this kind of video. This is just a new format that I'm trying out. I'd love to do more of this in the future. It was a lot of fun. In this video, we are going to be talking about the Haunting of Bly Manor, so obviously spoiler alert for that series. We're also going to get into some pretty deep stuff, so we've got content warnings for things like suicide, mental illness, terminal illness, and death. And if you're okay with all that, then like, comment, and subscribe, and enjoy the rest of the video. Thanks. Hey everyone, my name is Chris A. I'm joined here by my friend Bridget Badore. She is a very talented photographer. I've known her since high school, middle school probably. And we are going to be talking about the Haunting of Bly Manor today. I don't usually do videos like this, obviously. Usually I do kind of video essay style. So we're trying something new here, kind of podcast format. If you like it, let me know in the comments below. I hope you do like it. So, Bridget, where do you want to start with the Haunting of Bly Manor?
Oh man.
So I guess before we get started, question. So I have not seen The Haunting of Hill House. I also have not seen, or I haven't read Turning of the Screw or anything else that Henry James has written.
I have not read that. No.
Okay.
So I don't really have a lot of context for like the
original
ground,
text.
The original text of Bly Manor. I have seen Hill House, and as I have expressed to you, I was a big fan.
Yeah.
I think that there are some huge differences between the two that kind of like cast Bly Manor in like less of an impressive light for me.
Okay.
But I do think that there's still a lot there to discuss, and I'm sure like we're gonna get into all of this. But yeah, I haven't read that. I also like don't know the historical context for whatever Hill House is based off.
Okay.
But yeah, I also just recently watched Ouija, the prequel to Ouija, which is also one of the director's movie. I didn't realize that this director was like a Ryan Murphy type where he like casts a bunch of the same people over and over again. So like I had no idea of that going into Bly Manor, and I was like, oh, these are all the same actors. Like that was kind of an interesting kind of like a jarring thing, because I was like, oh, I thought this was going to be a whole new thing, and you're like learning how to reintroduce these faces in a different way. So that I think was also affecting the way I was reading Bly Manor throughout most of it. So I will say that like my favorite parts of Bly were the characters that like we didn't see as actors in Hill House. Hannah and Owen were my favorite.
So were they new from Hill House?
Yeah. So I don't know if what's the director's name?
I should know that. I should be prepared.
I know. I feel like I should have like notes because I'm really bad with names.
So the showrunners are you talking about Mike Flanagan maybe?
I think so.
Yeah. And then the showrunners are Daryl Frank, Justin Falvey, Trevor Macy, or those are just EPs, not necessarily showrunners. So probably Mike Flanagan. He's got that Ouija. He directed. He also directed Gerald's Game. Have you seen that?
I haven't. He has a very impressive list of things he's been involved in.
So actually, I want to have you watched Miracle Workers?
No.
Okay, so that was kind of one of the things that stuck out to me, while we're on the topic of casting. One thing I really love about anthology series, and the reason I bring up Miracle Workers is because they had it's an anthology series, and the first season was about miracle workers, so like kind of angels, kind of a purgatory setting. so that really lends itself to like colorblind casting, which is fun. But then the second season was based in like medieval, I guess, England. But they kept a lot of the same characters. So they had, people with darker complexions, but it wasn't, they weren't tokenized. They were just characters in medieval England, and it wasn't really a big deal. And that was kind of one of the things I liked about this was that, there were a lot of people of color. Granted, they were in service positions, but in the 80s in England, like it seemed like you could have gone with an all-white cast, and the fact that they didn't was kind of refreshing.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about that. When thinking about like the Mike Flanagan regulars are all mostly white folks.
Right.
So I was a little bit, I guess, like critical of like, are you just trying to take advantage of like a moment and introduce new people into your circle that was historically pretty white, like everything else you have made. But like, I love them. I love those actors. It was the first time being introduced to them, and I love their characters so much. But yeah, I mean, I'm a little critical of also the service positions.
I mean, really, everyone in the show was a servant, service worker. So that kind of explains that away. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely like a rich white family, and then all of their servants of color.
Right.
Anything else about kind of that before we get into? So I did read like the synopses before getting on the call. I am notoriously bad at remembering kind of story elements if I only watch things once. So I've got everything pulled up. But also the flip side of that is it's 9-hour-long episodes, so we're definitely not going to get into everything.
Right.
So I kind of want to talk more about the themes. And you and I have talked a lot about, or a little bit. We both, certainly I have grief and the death of loved ones plays a big part in my life and my lived experience. And I would say the same is true for you.
Yes.
So kind of, ghost stories in general really resonate with me. And in fact, one thing that we kind of talked before we got on this call was kind of the specific way Bly Manor represents ghosts and hauntings and the afterlife. So do you want to get into that?
Yes, totally. I also wanted to note that, like you said, you have a hard time remembering the specifics. And I think that this is really interesting for both of us to be talking about memory in general, which is a huge theme in Bly Manor. Both of us are people that, like you've said, grief has affected us in huge ways. And I know you have talked about this before about memory, and you talked about like music and how like your experience of memory feels so specific, and I can really relate to that too. So I like the idea that we're sort of coming into this from an interesting place where both of us are like, we're not super great with memory, but we like cling to really specific things.
Yeah. So it's great that you bring up memory. So one of the things that really stuck out to me about Bly Manor was its portrayal of death and the afterlife really felt tied into Mexican spiritualism. And certainly we've seen, I'm sure you've seen Coco, maybe even the Book of Life. And those are like explicitly Mexican stories. So it makes sense that they draw on those kind of religious undertones. But to see a story that was not explicitly Mexican or Latin American, deal with memory, kind of this intersection of memory and haunting, was really cool. And so when I say Mexican spiritualism, what I'm really getting at is this idea of when you die, certainly your physical being comes to an end, but at the risk of being reductionist, the basic idea is, as long as your memory lives on with your loved ones, you kind of carry on. And as someone who has lost, at this point, I've actually lost two parents, my mom and my stepdad, and that idea is very comforting to me. This idea of, yeah, I'm never going to see those people again, but I still have the memories, and my family still has the memories. And as long as that's there, there's still a loss, but it's something that we can hold on to. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, completely. I think we see that with all of the people who, like, we're going to be doing spoilers, right? We're not.
Lots of spoilers.
Okay. So all of the folks who die on the grounds eventually lose their face, their identity. And I think it's interesting to think about that in this context. They are not necessarily losing memory like on Earth in the same way that we see in Coco. Mm-hmm. They don't really speak to that at all, but like rather losing their relationship to their own identity and their memory of themselves, which is terrifying. When the two sort of main ghosts, whose names, of course, I'm forgetting.
When you say the two main ghosts, do you mean the
Peter
and Rachel? Rebecca,
yes.
Peter and Rebecca.
So when Peter and Rebecca are preparing to inhabit the children's bodies, mm-hmm. and they pull this, I think her name was Viola, the woman whose sister haunts the manor, and she's
Viola.
She's this faceless, like confused, grasping for mm-hmm. anything in front of her. That like was terrifying, and I don't know if I really cared so much for the visual of the faceless. Like I feel like they were a little mm-hmm. bit redundant with that, and they kind of kept putting it in our face, and I think it would have been more successful if it had been sort of a little blurry, or like we keep seeing the woman of the lake like with her face in front of the screen, and it's like to the point where you can see like exactly what they've done with like CGI or whatever. And it's like so much more effective in a scary movie when like you almost can't tell what's going on. So that I feel like they lost something there. But I feel like I'm like digressing now, and that's kind of maybe how I talk. But.
So while we're on the topic, are you familiar with the legend of La Llorona?
No. Will you tell me about it?
So La Llorona is, I learned it in New Mexico. I'm sure it's in Arizona and in northern Mexico as well, but it's very reminiscent of this idea. So basically there was a woman, and there are variations certainly, but the general gist is she learns that her husband is cheating on her, and so she kills her husband and she drowns her children, which the children may be illegitimate. That might be part of it. So anyway, she basically snaps and she kills her own children and she drowns them in the river. And then I think she might take her own life. But ultimately she ends up dying. And so she will kind of stalk the river looking for her children. And it's basically the exact same ghost that we see in Bly Manor, where it's kind of this cautionary tale of don't go hang out by the river at night, right? And the idea is if you're a kid and you're out by the river and La Llorona sees you, she will confuse you for her children, and she will take you into the lake or into the river. So that, I mean, that's like, it's the exact same story, right? It's this idea of once she has this kind of mental break in life, she can no longer figure out who's her children and who's not. And so she's just kind of like the Lady of the Lake in Bly. She's just blindly going around looking for children to take. And it's it's very much this tragedy, because we're certainly taught that La Llorona is someone to fear, but at the same time, the tragedy of the story is that she doesn't understand. She has lost her identity. She's not being malicious so much as trying to regain the children that she lost because of her mental illness. So that, I mean, that to me was like a 1-to-1. And I'm not sure if that's like how much of that is from Turning of the Screw or the other novels of Henry James, and how much is just kind of whole cloth. But I certainly saw that inspiration there.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that the Lady of the Lake in Bly almost like didn't have the opportunity to kill her family in that way. Like she was so hopeful that even in death she was going to be reunited with them when she realized that she was in the clothing,
the chest
box.
Yeah,
the chest, yeah. And then she's trapped and she's unable to hold them hostage in that way.
mm-hmm.
And yeah, but you see the same mirrored experience where she's in death continuing to look for that child. She cannot remember what has happened in her life. But yeah, so this actually, I talked to a couple of people about Bly, and everybody seems to say they hated the Lady of the Lake episode. And this is
like
interesting.
The flashback episode, you mean?
Yeah, the all black and white.
I love that one.
This is so interesting, and I want to hear more about that, because I love the Hill House kind of like flashback episode. I think I've been meaning to rewatch this one. It's the one that everybody kind of talks about, where they're at a funeral and you keep jumping back from the funeral to the house, to the experiences in the house, and you're sort of getting a little bit of the backstory. And there is a backstory in Hill House. There's the modern day, there's when they were all children, and then there's also like the other ghosts that inhabit Hill House. So sort of like the Lady of Bly. But in Hill House, we don't really learn that much about the other ghosts, which I think is kind of cool. Like it leaves a lot to question and sort of like sit in your head and wonder about. And it puts a lot more of the emphasis on the family dynamic. And the thing I love so much about Hill House is that you could take all of the ghosts away and it would still be a story of haunting. Like it would be a story about mental illness, of grief, addiction. They deal with so much. And it like that, I love Hill House because it feels like me. Like it feels like I grew up in that haunted house with a dead parent, and there weren't any real ghosts there. And that's almost the scarier part. Like I don't need to know about any of the ghosts that end up haunting them, because their real life is scarier.
Yes.
So I love that about Hill House. So I'm coming into it with a bias, of course. But this Lady of the Lake episode, it just felt so long to me. Like there's so much you hear. She gets up, she walks, she does like every single time. And it's like by the third time they say that, I'm like, I get it.
So that to me, and perhaps it was exactly where I was in that moment. But that to me was so, I don't even want to say profound, but it really resonated, because I'm kind of on the tail end of it. But my stepfather only passed away about 4 months ago. So I'm dealing with grief. I'm dealing with depression, and I am not, gainfully employed. I'm doing the videos as kind of my personal projects, but hearing that idea of waking up, walking, going to sleep, waking up, walking, going to sleep. I mean, it just feels like this is what depression is. Like you just get up, you kind of look around aimlessly, trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, and then you fall asleep. So I thought that was a really cool expression of depression,
Yeah.
and the way I get that it was repetitive, but so is depression, right? Like it's just every day
Right.
is exactly the same. So that resonated with me.
Yeah.
I also, have you watched the American Horror Story Roanoke?
Yes. Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot of parallels there too, right? This idea of there's certainly like kind of the main thing going on, but there's this, century old horror haunting. Um, to your point, yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. I think the best horror stories, and I've talked about this on my channel, the best horror stories are the ones where you can take the supernatural out and it's still, so something like The Witch, where it didn't matter if there was a witch because the family was tearing itself apart.
Right.
Um, it, yeah, I agree. I think Bly Manor did rely pretty heavily on the ghosts, but again, I think it's tough, right? Because the one thing that frustrates me is once the ghost makes contact, once the ghost starts to affect the physical world, there's no longer any question of what is the nature of this. This is a supernatural entity. What I kind of like about a lot of stories, and maybe Hill House is this way, is you never know if the ghosts are real or not. You never know if it's a hallucination. You never know if it's a ghost. You never know if it is, a manifestation of grief.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say Bly Manor didn't hit that mark, but again, I don't think they were trying to.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, because she's really the only one that has like a physical effect on anything, right?
The Lady of the Lake.
Yeah.
She's the only one that shows up like regardless of whether or not you believe in ghosts, I guess I
Yep.
would say. Like, the children do see Peter and Rebecca,
Mm-hmm.
but Danny doesn't. But Danny sees the Lady of the Lake regardless.
Right.
He sees, and the Lady of the Lake also leaves footprints. She
Right.
leaves like physical proof that she was there.
Yes and no. I'm going to push back a little bit because
okay.
Do we know that the footprints are actually there? Could they be hallucinations? I guess is what I'm getting at.
Right. Yeah. And it's like a shared hallucination among the house. Yeah. Yeah.
So hallucinations. This is something that in general I have a fascination with, but when it comes to ghost stories, I think the idea of hallucinations can be really powerful. And I put down some bullet points for talking points I wanted to come up with. And what I wrote is you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. So your eyes are, kind of input organs that focus, and I don't know exactly, but they interpret light. That's all they're doing. They're basically camera lenses. But it's the brain that's actually seeing what's happening. So that's why, that's why we do get hallucinations, because it's the brain that's putting all the images together.
Right.
And I know, a lot of ghost sightings can be chalked up to hallucinations. And that again kind of ties into either this mental illness or just stress-induced hallucinations, which I've experienced on a very minor level. Nothing like this, but in grief, sometimes you just have trouble interpreting what you're seeing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it hurts too. Like your brain is literally protecting you from
Mhm.
the reality of what's in front of you. So that's another like layer of grief and memory and just like the way the brain works that always just like fucks with me because your brain can omit
Mhm.
reality for you if it believes that you are not going to be able to handle it. And I remember, like, I think it was in college, I was taking a memory and film class.
Mhm.
We were talking about like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, things like that. And my professor had said this, like, scientifically, a repressed memory is your brain trying to protect you from
Mhm.
something that happened. And I just remember thinking, like, holy shit, like, there are things that I can't remember about my life that my mind believed that if I held on to them, I would die. Like,
Mhm.
if I held on to that image, I wouldn't be able to move forward. Like, how wild is it that we can have these things inside of us and those memories don't go away, they're just repressed, they're just
Yep.
like our brain puts a curtain over it but it still lives inside of us. So that's something that I think about a lot with haunting as well, where it's like we have these ghosts in our bodies
Mhm.
that are going to come up, and I think that happens for me. And maybe it's like a minor hallucination thing where like I start to feel scared and I have my adrenaline gets up, and these fears and these ghosts that are in my brain that I don't know what they are. I don't know what they look like.
Yep.
And so I have to make things up. And then that happens in front of me too. You look out your window and you see a shadow of something. You're like, was that real? I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's great. And I think that kind of also ties into what we see with the Lady of the Lake, this idea of her trauma, her a posthumous trauma, right? Um, is so great that her identity kind of erodes itself. And I think, that kind of, there's a theme of dementia in the series, and certainly Owen's mother having dementia is an explicit example of that.
Mhm.
Um, what I found really interesting was after basically immediately after Owen eulogizes his mother, um, which, while I'm on the topic, it's one of these things where I was just crying through the whole thing, but I was like, I can't not watch this. I need to absorb it. Um, in media, so often we will see the person with dementia, and in a lot of cases, sometimes it's portrayed very tastefully and very accurately. Um, I actually I haven't watched True Detective. Is that what it's called? I haven't watched it.
Okay. I haven't watched it.
I saw one scene, and there was a character with dementia, and I was able to peg it before it wasn't even said. It was just like, oh, this is a person with dementia. So that was done very well. Unfortunately, I don't even know the character or the episode. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, what I thought was really, really incredible was Hannah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Hannah's kind of her episode, the one
Her
dedicated.
episode was so good. That's the one that sits in my mind.
Yeah. And what I thought was so significant about this episode was, of course, by the end we learn that she is in fact dead, but the whole time, and starting from the first episode, I thought, does she have dementia, or is she in the early stages of dementia? Because when we first meet Hannah, she is zoning out, staring down the well.
Mhm.
She
She's
comes
somewhere
to
else.
Annie. She's a million miles away, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that's kind of how dementia presents itself early on, is just kind of zoning out, just kind of, oh, I'm sorry, what were we talking about again? Um, So when they gave her her own episode, it felt, I still was unsure. Is this a portrayal of dementia, or is this her being dead? And I think it could be both. I think, there's certainly this reflection of Owen and Hannah. Owen was, I hesitate to say attracted, but Owen was kind of drawn to Hannah because maybe they shared this experience.
Mm-hmm.
And what I saw in that episode that I took to kind of be a portrayal of dementia was every time she would walk into a new room, she would be somewhere else. And there was this moment of, where am I? Where am I? Where am I?
Mm-hmm.
And so often we see the outside of that. And in real life, that's what you see, right? Is you see the person, their location hasn't changed, but in their head it has. So, and I experienced this with my mother, is all of a sudden she would be a teenager and she would be talking to me as if she were a teenager, and, or she was in college, or she was, just 10 years ago, or whatever the case may be. So on the outside, you can see this happening very clearly, where she's kind of jumping around from location, space, in different spots in space and time. So to see the inside view of that, where we're seeing what Hannah was seeing, where here she is, and then all of a sudden she's somewhere new, and it's this moment of panic of, I need to figure out where I am so I can. It's almost like you don't want people to know. It's kind of like, I need to figure out where I am so that I can blend in. Not so much so that I can carry on, but so that no one figures out that I don't know that I belong here.
Mm-hmm.
Of course we do end up finding out that she was dead the whole time. But what really struck me is, so often in media we will see ghosts who are not sure if they're dead. And I really like that idea. I think there's some, I think it's a lot simpler than just, oh, I'm dying, I'm dead. What I think Bly Manor did differently was, not only did they have that gray area after death, but leading up to death. And I think there's something there. I think, so one of the things you hear that people experience before they die is they will speak to people who aren't there, especially people who have already passed away. So that, there's the obvious question of, what is happening there? Is it just a chemical response in the brain? Probably. But is it also the fact that they think they're dead already? They think they're dead while they're alive, and then after they die, they're not sure. So I really like this idea of kind of rather than death being a discrete event, kind of having a crossfade between life and death.
Yeah, I think something that came up for me when you were speaking about this was like, I feel like I can relate to that in between moment, just being like an alive person that has experienced somebody dying, because I think there's this thing that happens where your reality just isn't as grounded in life anymore.
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of what you were saying, I think, mirrored what we were saying before about haunting, about seeing ghosts, about seeing things like, and your brain just does shit to help explain things that don't make sense. So this closeness to death that I feel like maybe folks who have lost loved ones feel, something's coming up there for me, and I'm not really sure exactly what it is, but I think you see that a little bit in the children. They lose their parents. And what's interesting too about the show is that, like, I thought there was going to be so much more about the parents, and they only exist in the memories of the children. And to have them not be, you know, they didn't die on the grounds, so they're not the ghosts of Bly Manor, but it's just really fascinating to me that they don't play a bigger role in the show.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Right? But the children kind of seem like, you know, they're creepy and they see ghosts, but like all things considered are like kind of well adjusted.
Yeah.
Obviously, like the brother acts out a lot, and the brother's also just like being haunted, and there's something a little bit oversimplified in that for me that I feel frustrated with, because you can just explain away all of his behavior by saying that Peter was possessing him. And that like diminishes the reality of like being a grieving child to me, because like he would have been acting worse. Probably he would have been like struggling way more, and like with the sister as well.
Well, then do you think we could interpret it as it wasn't all Peter?
Right.
Because I think there's some ambiguity there, where certainly there are moments where we know Peter is possessing him, but I also kind of like this idea of, because I think before Peter possesses Miles and Miles kills Hannah, they're arguing, right? They're like in the woods arguing. And I think we can make the argument that because he is being haunted by Peter, he is acting out on his own accord at times. I agree that they seem remarkably well adjusted. I'm wondering if part of that is kind of the innocence of childhood, this idea of they are so young that they don't really understand what death is. Or when they see a ghost, when they're haunted, it's something a little bit different, but it's not, you're not, you know, as an adult, you see a ghost, you make all these connections. Maybe as a child, they're more open-minded. And so it's not, I don't know, maybe that's why they're not, I agree in general.
Right.
I think they could have done more with the kids.
Right. It's also coming from like Hill House. There's so much stuff with the family dynamic and the children's, the different ways that they have internalized their trauma throughout their lives. So I'm also coming from that, comparing that unfairly. I'm trying to like leave my love of Hill House aside. But yeah, I think there is something about their innocence, their, you know, they haven't completely decided what's real and what's not before their parents die. So there is this kind of like, I don't know, blurry, fuzzy reality that they already live in because their reality was shattered. So it is normal for them, which maybe there's something kind of nice and poetic about that too.
Well, I agree with you. I think there's a missed opportunity with the parents, because again, we're kind of falling back into this rules-based universe where because they didn't die at the house, they're not haunting the children, where so much of this show is about what is haunting, what does that really mean? What are ghosts? What happens when you die? And so I think they could have done something by having the parents haunt the children, even though they didn't die at the house. And maybe then they don't haunt anyone else because they have no relationship to Danny or to Hannah or to Owen. I think that could have been an added layer. I think they kind of missed out on that.
Yeah, I don't know if this is, I have this weird experience in my early adulthood, when I was like 19, I was dating an abusive person, which I think we could also talk about Peter in that.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that
lens. Yeah, but he like convinced me that I was haunted for a summer, and there was this conversation then, where we talked about the difference between a haunted house and a haunted human, and I think that would be like kind of what you're saying. Like, you have the haunted house, you have the ghosts of Bly, but you also have these children that inevitably, whether they are literally haunted or not, they are going to have the ghosts of their parents living inside of them.
Yes.
And we see that a little bit in their memories. Like, we see that the ghosts of their parents are the only idea of safety that they have left, and that's why they want to go back to the forever home, which I don't know if I understood that reference. Like, they live inside of the dollhouse now with their parents if Peter and Rebecca inhabit their bodies.
Oh, yeah.
And that might have been a reference to Hill House, because there is a forever home storyline there.
Interesting.
But I didn't really get that. And I think the only reason I heard that forever house line, maybe I made it up. I don't know. This is another conversation about memory, but I didn't really get that.
Yeah.
Or maybe I did.
I'm trying to remember that specifically, and I don't really. I remember there was some things with the dollhouse, but yeah, I mean, I think what we keep coming back to is like probably the biggest weakness of Bly Manor is its reliance on the supernatural. And I want to talk about Danny. And I want to talk about Danny and really bad with character names, Danny and Jamie.
Jamie, yes.
Okay. So Danny is obviously haunted the whole time by the death of her fiance.
Yes.
And that kind of goes to what you're saying about how she was haunted separate from the house.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how that was dealt with?
I have a lot of thoughts about that.
Oh, really?
Okay. I think I very briefly mentioned this when we were talking before about how I just feel like there was something missed there. And I do think it's worth noting that the director has said that this was supposed to be a love story. This was supposed to be like a gothic romance and not a ghost story the way that Hill House was. So that, to me, that kind of seems like a cop-out. It seems like to the director, he thinks that a love story is this oversimplified thing that doesn't deserve all of the same complex underlying plot points and narratives that something like a ghost story would have.
Yeah.
And
okay.
You're
onto something.
I think so. There are really complex things happening in Bly Manor, but I don't think that they're given the right weight. Owen and Hannah's love story is so compelling to me, and they don't even have a relationship. They don't even have a romantic love story, but I am like invested in them. When Hannah gets up after her episode, she keeps going back to that memory of being at the bonfire. And I love this so much because when talking about memory, there's something that happens every time you think about something specific, you think about it differently.
Yeah.
And one of my friends said when we were talking about Bly Manor that she loved that because every time you recall something, it becomes further and further away from the truth because you're working with whatever's going on in your head at the time, which is terrifying. And that to me is like a ghost story in itself, that like you get further and further away from the truth every time you recall something, which goes back to this Coco concept where like someone lives on every time you remember them, but like the truth of their existence might not.
Oh yeah. Okay,
right.
so a couple things there.
Hmm.
That kind of ties into the Lady of the Lake, right? This idea of every day she tries to remember what she's there for, and every day she gets farther and farther from the truth.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is what you're talking about with the way we remember loved ones who have passed on. Um, and I tried to do a little research into this. I didn't get too far, but I know I don't want to overgeneralize too much. So if any viewers want to correct me, feel free. But I know in a lot of Asian ghost stories, ghosts are kind of these distillations of people. And I recently watched, I think it's a Netflix series. It's called Two Sentence Horror Stories. Have you
Yeah.
seen?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and there's one about a young Korean woman who lost her fiance or husband, and he was abusive. And so she was not haunted by the totality of the person she lost, but she was haunted by this kind of uh, boiled down, just the abusive parts of him. And then, on the flip side, his mother was haunted by the child of him. Um,
Oh.
so you kind of got these two sides of who the person was in their life, how they affected different people, how they're haunting people differently. Um, just this idea of like when we lose people, we're haunted by them, whether that's through grief or through memory, and kind of voluntarily haunted. Like I want to spend time, and while we're on the top, well, I mentioned Mexican spiritualism earlier, but Dia de los Muertos is very much like you're choosing to be haunted. You're taking the time to welcome your loved ones back into your presence, kind of by giving them presents. Um, but I think to your point, um, it's very easy, and I'm certainly guilty of this. When I remember my mother, I don't think of any of the times she pissed me off. I don't think of any of the annoying things she did. I just remember the good stuff. And so, in some sense, I am haunted by this kind of distilled version of my mother as kind of this like idealized version, which I love my mother, still do. Um, but she was just like anyone. She was not perfect. But in my memory, I'm able to kind of keep her perfect because, like you're saying, every time I remember her, I'm able to remove little bits and bites of unpleasantness. Um, and it sounds like a lot of that's happening subconsciously.
Yeah. I think there's also something very unfair that happens um, in this experience where, like, I mean, to use my parents as an example, my father died when I was 3. So I was before the age of like really having concrete memories. So I rely a lot on other people's memories of him to know who he was. So they're all oversimplified versions of him. They're all like the good things, of course. And because of that, my mom sort of is forced to take the responsibility of like all of the bad things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's impossible for me to know like the reality of their relationship or the reality of like her experience. So I think that I don't know if I'm like really accurately portraying like what I'm trying to say about like the unfairness here, but I think like we as the living carry a lot of the bad stuff that they leave behind.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah.
Or it can be, like in the example I gave, it can kind of be split between people, and
Mm-hmm.
different people carry on different parts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know like I talk to a lot of folks with dead parents. There's a lot of what happens where like you take on this guilt as the child of like all of the bad memories that you have of them, and it doesn't feel like you're allowed to hold them. It doesn't, you know, like we live in a very binary world, unfortunately, and we're trying to push against that, but we're socialized that way too. And it's so hard to hold dualities, to be able to hold, like, I had a really terrible relationship with this person, but I miss them and I love them so much. And like, obviously that's a really extreme example. There are a lot of folks that had beautiful relationships with somebody that died, but they were still complicated because people are complicated, especially parent-child relationships. So yeah, I don't know. I like to think about that. I like to think about holding a lot at once, and how like the memory of the dead, just like, they don't have to. And it like sucks to be the alive person holding all of that. But you did ask me about Danny and Jamie. And I do want to go back to that.
Yeah, we kind of...
and, you know, and that
That's
happens.
Okay.
We're on this like memory, you know, there's a lot of different roads that we can take. But so Danny and Jamie, it's this like beautiful queer love story, and we love to see it. It's so sweet.
Yeah.
And like, I think that they lost something with Danny's coming out story. I think that they really oversimplified it because, you know, Danny was haunted by her fiance. The ghost of her heteronormative marriage, the ghost of like this life that she was trying to keep secret. And like, she had just come out to him moments before. She had just broken up with him. She had just broken his heart. And I also like, I don't know, I'm going to digress for 1 second and come back to this. In the moment where they're entering their engagement party and he's like, just this one thing and then they'll be off our backs forever. My partner and I were like, oh, they're both gay. And they're like doing this for each other. Like they're best friends. And you see that they're growing up, they're best friends. They're the only, you know, like they're safety for each other. Danny's fiance's family is her safety. Like she sort of has like the opposite relationship to the children, where like they lose their real safety is their biological parents, and they have to sort of make a new one with chosen people. And Danny was kind of given that. She didn't have safety with her biological parents, and she finds safety in her best friend from childhood's family. And, you know, she has the opportunity to marry into that life, and she has to turn her back on it, which is so heartbreaking. And she's coming out to him. She's breaking up with him. She's finally like, this is the first time I think that she is saying out loud that, you know, like she loves him so much, but she's not straight and she can't have that life. And then he dies immediately.
Yeah.
He opens the door and has this brutal, quick, terrifying death. And nobody knows what happened before he died.
Yep.
So she almost like, she gets away with it. She gets away with keeping this life, this opportunity to be a part of the family. The mother keeps coming back to her and checking in on her and saying, you're still this person to me. And her mother doesn't know what happened. And that is so scary. And to be able to hold all of that inside of her, like that's why she's haunted. There's so many things she's being haunted by. The memory of this person that she loved, who she broke his heart, and they didn't get to mend that before he died. He was angry at her. He wanted to push her away, and they didn't have an opportunity to come back together. She was saying goodbye to this potential safety that she had with him. She was saying goodbye to the safety of passing as straight in like a society that was not, you know, like her and Jamie weren't able to get legally married. They wore the rings and they knew it for each other. And that was a really sweet moment. But yeah, she's haunted by a lot in this figure with the headlight eyes. And then, you know, she has a little bit of tension with Jamie. She has kind of effectively one moment where she tries to connect with Jamie and to share herself with her and be honest about the reality that she's being haunted. And then she sees him. It's like, oh, no, I can't do this. And then the next time they try, it's just like, easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Well, because the change is she throws the glasses in the fire, right? Like she kind
right.
of, yes, I think a couple of things there. First of all, queer representation, I think they did really responsibly. I wrote down like, it's not the only thing, but it's not nothing. And I think so often you'll see queer characters that either their queerness has nothing to do with their story, which is fine, but it kind of disregards the reality that that's a thing, right? And then the flip side is that's the only thing. So I like how she had a queer storyline, but she had a storyline that had nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. You know, her relationship with the children, her haunting is tied in a little bit, but even if she had been straight and her fiance had died like that, she would have been haunted. So I totally agree. I think I wish Danny and Jamie had more time to get together, because I feel like right the second that Jamie saw Danny, she was like, yep, I'm into her. And then they flirted a couple of times, and then it's like, okay, they're together now. So I think going back to what you said about, it's kind of a cop out to call this a love story, because we didn't get as much depth as we could have with, you know, their relationship. Or
we got
Hannah.
more with Owen and Hannah.
Yeah.
In really getting nothing. Like all we see of them in reality together, there's nothing there. We see them in each other's memories, and like there's more there than there is in the reality of Danny and Jamie, which to call it a love story, it's like add more complexity to the love story here.
Yeah. Dan, I had another thing about Danny and Jamie. So I want to talk about obsessive thoughts and intrusive thoughts and how those play a role. Was that
with Danny after she accepts the lady in the lake?
Right. So there's a couple things that I thought were really kind of powerful. This idea of something terrible is going to happen, but I don't know when. And both for Danny being scared of the Lady of the Lake, and Jamie scared of losing Danny to the Lady of the Lake. There's also, you know, kind of the final shot of she leaves the door open when she goes to sleep. And I don't know how much of this is intentional, but there's it got some traction like 10 years ago, but there's this like spoken word poet who talks about obsessive compulsive disorder. And he talks about, you know, checking the lights and closing doors and things like that. And then when he loses his partner, none of that matters. And he leaves doors open and he leaves the lights on. And it's this really powerful moment of like, you know, the reason I do want to get into, if we can, I want to get into obsessive compulsive disorder. Because I have been diagnosed with severe obsessive compulsive disorder. And there's kind of this popular misconception that it is all about neatness and tidiness. And, you know, like my guitar there is slightly askew, and I'm sure someone would be like, oh, that bugs my OCD. Well, so just a crash course for my viewers, because I was going to do a video on this topic, but I never really got around to it. But So obsessive compulsive disorder, there are two elements, right? There's obsessions and there's compulsions. I have more obsessions than compulsions. You can have one and not the other. They can be tied. It can be 50-50 split, whatever the case may be. So I have a lot of what are called intrusive thoughts. And so for example, when Danny's fiance was killed by the truck, that really resonated with me. I have a huge fear. I was in a pretty bad car accident in 2012. So I have a fear of car accidents. I don't like driving. I especially don't like other people driving.
Mm-hmm.
But so part of my OCD, part of the way it manifests is, let's say I am at home and my wife is coming home from work and let's just say I want a soda or something. I want a candy bar. Pre-COVID. Let's assume this is pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I want something that is not essential, right? And so my brain says, well, if you text her and ask her to go to the store and she gets in an accident, that's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And then my brain says, well, if you don't text her and she gets in an accident because she didn't go to the store, that's your fault. Mm-hmm. So this idea of kind of no matter what happens, something terrible could happen and that's your fault. And that's where the compulsions come from, is like, how can I prevent that from happening? Okay, I can check my oven, make sure it's off so the house doesn't catch on fire. I can lock all the doors. I can turn the lights off. I can, it gets more extreme than that, but I won't get too much into it. But at the end, this idea of Danny knowing that there's something around the corner, and for everyone, that's death, really. And that's kind of at the heart of a lot of obsessive and intrusive thoughts, is this idea of no matter what happens, in 10 minutes, I could be dead. So you never know. So this obsession of something's following me, and it might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might not be this year, but eventually it's going to get me. And then the flip side of that is Jamie's concern too, is first of all, when Danny is still alive, this idea of I'm going to lose her. I don't know when, but something terrible is going to happen. And then after Danny goes into the lake, this idea of I need to leave my door open. I need to sleep by the door on the off chance that tonight's the night.
Yeah.
So both of those things really reflected kind of obsessive personality traits to me, which I found very powerful. What do you think about that?
There are a couple of things that came up for me. I think from Danny's perspective, this is again another thing where it's like she didn't even need the Lady of the Lake. She had the experience of watching her last fiance die. So the moment she accepts love into her life again, she's accepting that that's going to happen again. And that's all she's known. So that's the truth to her, that you're gonna die and it's gonna be my fault, So it's, like most ghost stories, the representation of the ghost or the monster or the haunting, whatever, it's an easy way to explain what's happening mentally for the person. So it's an easy symbolism. It's an easy representation of that fear. I think that also with Danny's belief that there's something inside of her that's evil, that's going to come out. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of different ways that could go. And for me, I might be reaching because I have that thought. And I think there's two things that I can relate it to Danny. It's you know, like she came out and her fiance died, like a really terrible thing happened, and it's really easy to relate that to her queerness and to be like, this is a bad thing that's inside of me, especially if she was socialized that way.
Yep.
And, you know, like accepting a society where everything is binary, you know, like I don't believe in good or bad, but like if that's the way you're socialized, you're inevitably going to have those thoughts.
Yeah. Can I cut in real quick?
Yeah.
So I actually, another thing, so one of the like indicators of obsessive compulsive disorder is this idea of, you know, a lot of intrusive thoughts are based around bad things happening, but a lot of them are also, I think it's like socially or religiously unacceptable or things like that. So, you know, kind of like, I don't know, punching a priest. I don't, a bad example, but it's this idea of, if I am queer and like Danny, Danny's kind of making this connection of, if I do something that I think or believe is wrong, even if it's totally disconnected. So I am queer, therefore my fiance dies. I mean, that is literally a portrayal of obsessive compulsive disorder. So go on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, personally, I feel I haven't been diagnosed with anything. I just started going to therapy a year and a half ago. And
For the first time?
For the first time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And
Good
I think
for you.
like, thank you. Thank you. It was a long and hard journey to get myself there. It was like, you know, I think if I go, I'm admitting that I'm wrong, I'm flawed, I'm whatever. And if I could just keep ignoring that, then maybe it won't come out. You know, I'm trying to like repress this bad thing inside of me that I'm running from, that I'm terrified from. And obviously by like going to therapy and by talking about it and becoming friendly with the multitudes that I contain, the reality that I could snap and be taken over by the bad thing becomes less and less of a possibility. So I pick at my skin a lot, which I know has been linked to potential OCD relation.
Do you
Yeah.
Do you have fidget spinners or anything like that?
I don't.
So I pick, that's why this eyebrow is missing. But my therapist told me to get fidget spinners. So I bought a 12 pack and now I just like, oh, it's great.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I used to work at an after school, so we would always have things to touch and fidget spinners and things like that around. I haven't like found anything that works for me. I think like I really get into this thing where I'm like, I am bad, and if I can groom myself or like fix myself, if I can pick off any scab or ingrown hair, like if I can pick whatever's wrong, if I have like a hangnail, if I have like anything, it's just like, well, if I can pick that off, like maybe I'll get to the thing that's wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I also like have a therapist that's very much like, I think recognizes that if I identify something that could be wrong with me, that I might obsess with it, and I might just be like, okay, well, that's the thing that it is, and I'm going to lean into it. So he's like, what if you can just accept that that's a thing, that's your reality. Like, it's not wrong. Just because not everybody has it doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Yep.
So I like that he sort of encourages me to play around with the ambiguity and the duality of everything. So that was all to say that I have not been diagnosed with anything ever. But I think there might be a couple of things at play here. So
yeah, I mean, I think it a lot of this goes back to this idea of nothing exists on a binary. You know, right. I think I probably have some degree of autism. I certainly have some degree of PTSD, but my PTSD is not the same as someone who goes to war. Obviously, those are very different traumas. So yeah, I mean, really at the end of the day, it's not about checking a box. It's about communicating. It's about, if I put these three words together, obsessive compulsive disorder, that means a specific set of things that I can communicate to a mental health professional, and we can work on those things. So it's, I mean, it's not like diagnosing the flu so you know which chemical to put in your body to make it better. It's about, how does your brain work, and how can we work with it?